Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. The Victoria Arts Council and the Creative Mornings Victoria operate from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen speaking people, now known as the First Nations Songhees and Esquimalt. And we recognize these traditional lands and territories out of respect and as a step towards further reconciliation and doing good work together going forward. As Creative Mornings is a lecture series where words carry meaning and hopefully open up to new ideas, we want to start this off by being very open and transparent about where we are and how we operate. So my name is Kagan McFadden, and I'm the Executive Director of Victoria Arts Council and co-lead of Creative Mornings Victoria. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this next talk we're about to have, and to introduce our speaker and the larger Creative Mornings project. Here is my co-lead and co-worker, Leah McInnes.
Thank you, Kagan. So I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides to go through to thank our sponsors, and then I'm going to introduce our speaker. Just loading. So as Kagan said, welcome to Creative Mornings. December's theme is invisible. The invisible encompasses everything that does not fall within the hegemony of visibility. An entire world we cannot see exists, but doesn't show itself. From the electromagnetism coursing around us, to the flow of capital across borders, to the adaptive strategies of wildlife. How might we become aware of the things that have receded from sight, suddenly coming into focus with startling clarity? The Rome chapter of Creative Mornings chose this month's exploration of invisible, and Christina Spano illustrated the theme. We'd like to thank MailChimp, Creative Mornings' official global partner for marketing. MailChimp & Co. wants to help you learn in good company. Did you know they have a page full of resources for freelancers and agencies? There are in-depth stories and insights all designed to support you. A couple of our favorite articles are 6 Steps for Increasing Referrals and the Science Behind the Art of Marketing. If you want to find out more about this and grow your own freelance company, check them out. We'd also like to thank Skillshare. Skillshare is our global partner for online learning. Explore your creativity on Skillshare, where millions of inspiring humans share wisdom, experience, and expression in a learning community that will lead you to a creative journey and new places. Give the gift of learning this year with an incredibly special deal from Skillshare. You can receive 2 one-year Skillshare memberships for the price of 1. The sale goes on until January 3rd, 2022. We would also like to thank the City of Victoria for their ongoing support and for setting up the Victoria chapter of Creative Mornings, as well as HCMA. HCMA is an architecture firm that designs buildings, brands, and shared experiences that connect people. So we are the Victoria Arts Council hosting this chapter of Creative Mornings. And just a reminder for those who are in the region that we have our holiday show and sale, Little Gems, ongoing until Sunday. So come check it out. There's over 70 artists, everything priced under $500. There's lots of really interesting little gifts and just beautiful art. So come check it out. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Rick Waines. Rick Waines is a playwright working on the unceded territories of the Lekwungen people, known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. His third play, a verbatim drama, In My Day, is in development at ZZ Theatre and is slated for a production at the Vancouver East Cultural Centre in December of 2022.
Oops, sorry, go ahead. You go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, so I'm going to pass it over to Rick.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here with you to give a talk. It's been a long time, really. This used to be my my job. I used to tour with a piece of theater, and my job was to talk with people about things. But I feel very out of practice, so bear with me. One of the ways that I am keen to begin is that, especially in these days of our current pandemic, and remembering the pandemic I'm most familiar with, which is HIV, and the fact that we all experience loss. I wouldn't mind just spending somewhere in the neighborhood of a minute, just reflecting on folks that we miss. And that can mean whatever you like, but I have my timer set. So if you just take a moment to look inward and remember those folks, and then we'll get started. So that was about half a minute. I didn't want anyone to think that I was trying to, cheat on my 20 minutes by spending too much time in silence. I have a fairly short prepared statement, but first, I know from a bunch of the conferences that I go to that in the research and medical profession, people are asked to disclose their disclosures, my disclosures, and I think it just informs my sort of perspective, I guess, is I'm middle-aged, very middle-aged, white cisgendered male who identifies as mostly straight, and so that's sort of that's just kind of who I am. My people come from Scotland and England and Ireland, and played a role in the colonization that we all are, a part of in one way or another. So that's probably a good place for me to start. So invisible, I was asked to be invisible. My community wanted me to stay quiet. I'm not certain why my instinct towards disclosure won out. I'm sure my mother had something to do with it, but I can't say that I come from the kind of people with a long history of speaking out or up at all. My uncle wanted me to remain invisible, like he was trying to remain. He was afraid for me. He was afraid for himself. Everyone I knew with my condition in the mid-'80s wanted nothing to do with the attention that GRID and the 4-H's promised. GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. And the 4-H's were homosexuals, Haitians, heroin users, and hemophiliacs. I was born with a bleeding disorder, hemophilia, which I won't get too far into the weeds around, but it is a bleeding disorder. And in my case, it means I bleed too much, mostly in joints. I am the hemophiliac H. We do get occasional mention in popular culture. The second to last episode of the HBO series Succession, for example, we had a couple of hilarious mentions there, but otherwise, we're not very well known unless you're into Russian history or Rasputin. Now, as early as 82 or so, 1982, it was becoming clear that due to our blood products we were taking to manage our condition, we were at risk of getting a virus that would eventually become known as HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. And this virus would, in most cases, lead us to a new acronym that would replace GRID, AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. It wasn't good news. Within my community of people with bleeding disorders, it turned out that 90% of us would acquire HIV, and most of those would be dead within 10 years. There are a few of us that made it. I got lucky. Survivor bias also played a role, and that's something I'll get into just a little bit later. It may be obvious by now, but my community didn't want, my community wanted to remain invisible. We didn't want any attention. Well, they didn't want any attention brought to them by at that time as well. Let's put it this way: people with bleeding disorders are no less homophobic than any other slice of Canadiana. So being part of the 4-H club, not the 4-H club that was taking care of orphaned cows, sheep, and pigs, but the 4-H's of homosexuals, Haitians, heroin users, and hemophiliacs, was not a club that most of us were excited about joining. For some reason, I needed to be visible. Somehow I understood that my life, at least in part, depended on it. So I started to talk about it. And as we all know, talking is a gateway drug that leads most often to theater. And so for the next 15 minutes or so, I'll give you an overview of my work in the theater as an AIDS educator, because I guess that's what I am. An AIDS educator that works in the theater. My first play, Dragonfly Drinking, through the story of Annabelle and Jaya, helped me to understand what sacrifices may be required to truly live. My second play, Secrete, helped me to understand my own and my country's struggle with disclosure and the criminalization of HIV. And finally, on to In My Day, work that I'm currently engaged in is a story of pandemic response in the first 15 years of AIDS, commonly known as the plague years, which held extraordinary victories and heartbreaking failure. In My Day will be my third play dealing with HIV's societal effects. Today, this may seem a bit anachronistic. So many other concerns have displaced this wee but mighty virus from our collective memory. No matter, I will continue, especially now as we struggle with our most recent pandemic. All these stories and my work to date have been about bringing my experiences as an HIV positive person out into the light for others to see and perhaps understand. And also, I think I'm a steward of others' stories as well. And it is important for me that they are not lost, that this time isn't reduced to invisibility, because there's lessons there. Now, there has been a bit of a resurgence of late with TV shows like Pose and It's a Sin. But for me, it's important that the stories of the people I knew are told. And in the telling, the people themselves can put off their third death. And you're probably mostly familiar with the idea that we have three deaths. One is when our heart stops beating. The second is when we are put in the ground. And the third is when our name is last spoken. And so there's, folks whose names I'll probably speak today who I miss a great deal. So 34 years since being diagnosed with HIV, and it keeps asking me to write. But first, a little background to perhaps understand why HIV has been such fertile ground for me. So contextualizing, when I was 15 or so, I was asked to travel across Europe with a group of other hemophiliacs. We were going to go to the World Congress of Hemophilia in Stockholm, Sweden. We landed in England and got on a train, and I was chaperoned across Europe by a fraternity president from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He was a few years older than me and would make gin and sevens as we rolled across Europe. I'd never been away from my family in North Delta, where I grew up. And I was 15 or 16 and drinking gin and sevens with the fraternity president from Louisiana. And I really felt very alive. And I was in bars having beers. And I remember beginning to feel like an adult. And we arrived in Stockholm, and I left the hotel and went across the street. And in Stockholm, it is on lunch break in the summer, it is common practice to have one's lunch in the park and get partially naked. So for a 15-year-old kid from North Delta, I really felt like I had arrived in some alternate universe. No one in North Delta was taking their lunch in the front yard with their tops off. So I think I started to really understand my place in the world as a 16-year-old with feelings. And the next morning, we were at the opening plenary, and a doctor by the name of Bruce Evett got up and talked about this virus that was, this would have been 82 or 83 or so, this virus that had been found and was causing a great deal of anguish in the gay community, and that we could expect to see it in our community, and that there would be a great many deaths from that. And I remember looking down the road to my friend Scott, thinking, oh man, that's a real buzzkill. And I feel like that's very bad news. And it was, of course, but at that, being a 16-year-old at the time, I quickly diverted my attention to other concerns. But a few years later, I would find out I had HIV. It was no surprise. My uncle had it. Yeah, obviously in a moment like that, your life changes forever, especially in, the mid 80s, when I think we've lost a little bit of context. There wasn't, if you had HIV in 1987, which is when I was diagnosed, there wasn't any sort of notion that you were going to survive. There was a notion of how long were you going to live. So my life changed radically. I just graduated from photography college, and but photography instantly had no real meaning any longer. So I wanted to be involved in the world of AIDS. And also, as I said in my opening, the folks I knew with hemophilia didn't want to be associated with HIV, again, because, we have grown up in a culture that is pretty thick with homophobia. And that was the largest reason. For some reason, I didn't really feel that way. I don't know exactly why. And I recognized that gay men were at the front of this fight. So I got invited to go to the Montreal conference in '89, which was sort of a pivotal moment in AIDS activism, where ACT UP, took the stage and demanded to be included in all decisions affecting their lives. And that was meaningful to me, because it was the first time I think I'd experienced the intersection of art and activism and health. And I met there some folks from an organization called the Vancouver Persons with AIDS Society, Alex Kowalski, Pei Lim, and Don DeGagne. And they invited me to come back to Vancouver and join their organization. I also met a fellow at that organization, at that conference, named Herbert Daniels. He was a Brazilian man who was very involved in Brazilian politics. And I met him, and he gave me this book. It's called Life Before Death. Basically, it was about how he knew he was going to have a death that was straightforward, but what kind of a life was he going to have before that? Because in Brazil, I guess, when you were diagnosed with AIDS, you were seen as a dead person. And so he wanted to sort of rail against that. He was a beautiful man, and he gave me this book, and he wrote in the book, he wrote, because life is still the best thing I know. And then I lost that book immediately. I don't know how. I saw him again at a conference a couple of years later, and he wrote he wrote the same thing again. And then I don't know, I lost that book. And this one I got from my mom, who was better at saving things. I'm not going to lose this one. So I went back to Vancouver and got involved with this organization, and I was the only straight kid there. And these men began to teach me how to live and how to die. And I started doing, and this moves into my sort of period of like art as survival. They had this art therapy group that I thought sounded like a great idea. So I started going, And I recognized that through art therapy, I could start to make visible some of the feelings I was having and trying to understand my place inside of AIDS activism in Vancouver. I've realized that I've already chewed up 15 minutes, so I'm going to move along a little faster. I have a fairly evocative art therapy session involving a duck that I might share with you at some point later, but it won't take too long. I do remember Ray. He used to show up at art therapy once a week, and over a course of a few months, I watched Ray disappear. He just got smaller and smaller, and then one day he wasn't there anymore, and I guess I thought maybe he had died, but then he showed up again a few weeks later, a month or so later, and what had happened is he was on his way home from a bar and had been beaten, close to death. And I think that was a moment where I recognized that the impact of homophobia and the very real costs. Ray did die a few months later. Last time I saw him, he was digging through the library at PWA, like his life depended on it. And he was dead a week or two later, and I always wondered what he was looking for in the bookshelves. I became involved with the Speakers Bureau and started to recognize the power of stories. And then when my time at PWA was over, I joined the Green Thumb Theater with a show called The Cost of Living, where I toured with a play, and I would come out after the show and talk with the kids about HIV. And their first question to me always was, "How did you get it?" And that was code for "Are you gay?" And so I would take the kids on a bit of a story. What became important to me during those years was that talking about how to use a condom and what the virus looks like and wasn't what I was super interested in. Those are important things. What was interesting to me or important to me was that I had hemophilia and I was seen as an innocent victim, or my friends like Alex and Lim and Pei were seen as having done that to themselves. And I think in talking with that about the kids, I think I was able to start to dig around a little bit in some of the root causes of transmission of a virus like HIV, which are homophobia and racism and sexism. And then when that show was done, toured with that for about 10 years, I wanted to tell my own stories. So I wrote Dragonfly Drinking, which was a play that I was on a beach in Trinidad after a conference and minding my own business, and a woman and her son literally walked out of the ocean. He was very small, on her hip, sat down, said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I'm at this AIDS conference. I'm HIV positive." And she said, "I have AIDS, so does my son, and I'm showing him the world before he dies." And they were from Switzerland. And I think what I recognized in that moment was that there was a difference between, staying alive and living. And so I wrote Dragonfly Drinking for them. And then at that time, I really wanted to talk about the criminalization of HIV. When I found out I had HIV, my doctor said to me, "Right, you have HIV. You can't have sex without a condom. Do you have any other questions?" Everyone was struggling, including my doctor, But that was sort of the sum total of my of the support I was given to manage living with a communicable virus. So I struggled the very first time I hadn't had intercourse at that time. And the very first time I had intercourse, I didn't tell the woman I had HIV, and we didn't use a condom. And that, as you can imagine, haunted me for a great many years. And I wanted to write about that. I also was aware at the time of a woman in Montreal who had been, beaten by her boyfriend quite repeatedly. Finally, she called the police. The police came, took him away. At the station, he told the police that his girlfriend had failed to disclose to him the first time they had sex, that she had HIV. And so they released him and put her in jail. And so with the criminalization, with my play on criminalization, so I sort of pushed those two stories together, my story and her story, to maybe to attempt to have a more open conversation about disclosure, and that play was in Victoria about a year ago, 2 years ago, who knows? Who knows? Last Wednesday. And then shortly thereafter, I became part of and I'll finish here. Shortly thereafter, I became part of an oral history project called HIV in My Day, where the University of Victoria were interviewing people who lived through the first 15 years of the pandemic in Vancouver, known as the plague years. They're people who survived and their caregivers. I was interviewed for that project and found it a pretty profound experience, helping to sort of sort out some of my feelings about those years. I wanted to get involved with the project, so I became part of the community-based research team, and then started transcribing interviews and recognized that there was a bunch of great material there, 118 extraordinary interviews that I could build a piece of verbatim theater out of. Verbatim theater being, you find a resource like that and you arrange portions of these interviews into a story. So that process began at the Belfry about a year ago, and then through some support through ZZ Theatre in Vancouver and Norman Armour, who founded Push Festival. We got some success with grants and also some support from the Vancouver East Cultural Centre, and we've begun our development period. Just finished our first workshop, and we will be, if we get one more important grant, we will be producing it December 1st, World AIDS Day next year. There's all kinds of stuff that has come up in preparing that piece. It's 118 interviews, and a very large portion of them are from gay white men. Obviously, the plague years didn't affect just gay white men, and now the project has done a great job of reaching out to other folks. But I spoke about survivor bias earlier. If you were a middle-class gay white man or someone like me, you are just far more likely to survive than other folks. And also, it should also be said that gay men in general have paid a very heavy price for HIV. So through the arranging of these stories, I've had to think a lot about how I'm going to represent lesser represented folks, and given my lens that I talked about in the beginning, how am I going to ensure that I'm doing that well? And we have a really important part of our work is I have a committee called CARE, and they're made up of folks who have firsthand experience of the plague years and who come from racialized communities, and they're providing me with the support I need to make sure that the stories of other folks that I don't understand the impacts that HIV has had in their lives, that those stories get told in the best way I can. I'm going to stop there because I've gone over, and I know that's not a big deal, but maybe there are other there's some questions at this point that I could dive into, and if not, I could tell you a little bit more about that project.
That was great, Rick. Thank you so much. I think it's so important to have these sort of very open discussions, and where sort of life and the medicalization of our existence overlaps with creativity. So that was pretty profound. I love that you approach, or you offered a few different approaches to your creative practice here, the verbatim theater, what you're working on now, but also even anecdotes and how important anecdotes are, like the the piece that happened on the beach and what that led to. And then of course your very real disclosure, both of how you live, but also maybe certain regrets you've had. So thank you for that honesty. I'm wondering, based on those sort of three prongs, if there's beyond, next year, and of course it's so hard to think about one project after another, but beyond this current project, if there's another tact of creative approach that you're interested in exploring as a playwright or beyond.
Yeah. I guess eventually I feel like I might like, eventually I might like to write either something that, well, this is my first step. I haven't included any of my own interview in this In My Day project, because I didn't want to write about my experiences anymore. And I also think that maybe my next play I might not want to write about HIV at all, although I continue to, it's my my muse, I guess. I do have I feel like I wouldn't mind writing not about HIV and not about myself. And I have a couple of ideas of projects, but I don't know that I'm in a position that I'm able to speak about them yet, because they're still too nascent. But I do have other projects. But I think moving away from HIV and moving away from my story would be something I'd like to grow into.
Are there other questions for Rick? Maybe Brett or Erin have questions or comments?
Just following that, I mean, I'm just curious, would you stay in writing plays, Rick, or are you interested? I mean, if you don't want to tell your own story, then memoir is not for you, but
yeah.
Where would you go? Like novellas or?
Yeah, right. I feel like at some point I have a memoir in me. And I do have a sort of a first draft of that. But what I love about theater is is that you spend all this time by yourself, stewing away and just building whatever the heck it is you like. But I really like people. And so at some point in theater, you have to reach out to other people. Like you're aside from monologue shows, and I have affection for those. I just love that you are able to be in rooms with other people and sorting things. And I'm not a control freak, which is good. So I love that I can turn something over to folks and that they can bring their gifts to it that only serve to improve what I've managed to bang out. So I love the form. I've just, I was a theater kid in high school, and I just I can't get enough of it. So I suppose I would like to continue on with that. Oh, well, there is one. I mean, I'll share with this. This In My Day project is likely to be optioned by a fellow who builds film and TV. And he recently did a show that you can watch on CBC, which talks about the tainted blood crisis called Unspeakable. And it's a great insight into what the bleeding disorder community went through. And you can watch that on Gem. But he's thinking about optioning this script that I'm working on. So maybe I'll be involved with a piece of film and TV. I mean, I know options don't really mean that things are going to get made, but that'd be fun. That'd be great. Great experience, or probably terrible experience, but it'd be a good one to have.
Probably terrible, but good to have.
Yeah.
Just kind of going back to the theme of invisible and the larger December recognizing World AIDS Day on December 1st, Victoria Arts Council for the last 3 years now has presented, in partnership with Visual AIDS New York, a screening that Visual AIDS commissions HIV positive filmmakers and then distributes these films worldwide, mainly through museums and other educational places. And so the Arts Council takes it, and we partner with, well, this last December 1st, we partnered with the Vic Theatre to give a really big, presentation. Anyhow, and so there's these different themes that they enact through their commissions each year, different lenses that they try to put on the conversation of how HIV continues and AIDS is not over. And this year's theme was around community care and long-term survivors. But what was really fascinating to me was how, and I think this is, again, going back to ideas of invisible or what becomes visible, is that long-term survivors are speaking out against community care and the problems that have arisen, in particular with the medicalization of the movement, and how it dovetails or egresses against things like racism and other biases. So, for example, there was a really good documentary that was shot by people working in community care, specifically around, I think it was around kind of drug users, but also HIV positive people. And the CEO of that, or the director of that organization, was accused of sexual assault and racism and in particular anti-Black racism in their community. And how it took actually this person, he went on a medication strike, so not like a version of a hunger strike, but he refused to take his life-saving medication until this person was removed from their position, as a kind of protest, right? So I'm just, this is like a lot of information I'm just, spouting out, and without having seen the screen or the screening, maybe you had seen it or not, but anyway, it's available through visual aids, and I really recommend it. But just thinking about how things come to light, and sometimes it does take, 20 years, and we're now recognizing, with the introduction of protease inhibitors in the early to mid 90s, that all of a sudden people do live much longer and can, live longer, which was never really thought, to be an option, as you mentioned. So what other things are you thinking might come to light or come out of being invisible and into a visible conversation?
Well, there's all kinds of stuff in there, but it's all kinds of stuff that I've been thinking a lot about within my day. And that sort of triggers me back into not triggers in a bad way, I promise. It reminds me of, so community care, if by community care, we're meaning organizations like Vancouver Persons with AIDS, AIDS Vancouver, Healing Our Spirit, the many Positive Women's Network, AIDS Vancouver Island. There's a really fascinating story to tell there, and I'm grappling with it in the script in my day. So there's when these community care networks were built, they were built by, in Vancouver, and I can speak to Vancouver, the AIDS Vancouver, Persons with AIDS were built by gay white men who lived in the West End. And they were organizations that were, critical to the survival of a great many people. But these organizations also had struggles with inclusion. I know because I was there, and it played a fairly significant role in my relationship to Vancouver Persons with AIDS. So in my years of working at PWA were like 88 to 91 or 2-ish. And in that period of time, in the early 90s, we began to understand, and it's also important to recognize that we didn't understand the impacts outside of the gay community and the blood transfused community very well until the early 90s. And that's not because it wasn't happening, but because it started to become very apparent to us at PWA that there were many folks outside of the gay white men from the West End that were living and dying with HIV. And how were we going to welcome those folks into our organizations. One of the super interesting conversations that came out of that was, so there's all these amazing posters out of this organization at the time, out of this organization called Dutch Aidshilfe. And the posters were extraordinary and erotic and moving and touching, and largely, not exclusively, but largely homoerotic imagery. And those are largely the posters that came home from conferences, because there was largely gay men that were at the conferences to begin with. So these posters were up in our space. And so the conversation was, what do we do if we're trying to welcome straight folks, folks who are coming to HIV through injection drug use? What do we do about this space? And so do we pull down all of this empowering queer imagery in order to make it a safer space for straight folk from outside? So this conversation alone caused a great deal of consternation, as you can imagine. And the organizations, PWA AIDS Vancouver, never wrestled with it very successfully. And so what ended up happening is that you ended up with organizations that weren't able to serve folks from different communities. And so other organizations started to pop up in order to serve those needs, instead of finding a way to, doing the heavy lifting to try and find a way for these organizations to become inclusive. And I think it has led to the fact that a great many of these organizations no longer exist. And so we weren't able to create a common room, and that was a problem. So jumping forward to my play, we have 118 interviews, and I forget the math, but like 85 of them are gay white men. And so how do I tell this story and include everyone when there's so little material? Now, we do have enough material for it to work, but it's still, if you were to break down the ethnicity of every line in this play, it's still heavily skewed towards gay white men. So when I began to start to try and wrestle with this, I approached it from epidemiologically. I said, so what does the BC Centers for Disease Control say about who had HIV in those first 15 years? And what the BC Centers for Disease Control says about HIV in those years was that gay white men were the people who were getting HIV. So I initially was like, look, if this is the math we have on this, it's probably not, I can make sense of this imbalance. But I've been, my perspective in this last few weeks has done a bit of a 180, in the sense that those statistics can't really be relied upon, because there are extra barriers to testing and treatment for folks from racialized communities or folks from the downtown east side. So there were a great many more people that had HIV, obviously, than the BC Centers for Disease Control were able to report for. So how do I handle this? And I think that what I've understood through the help of and support of my care committee is that we just need to ensure that the stories that we do have are featured, foregrounded, are placed in important spots, talking about important things. And also it's important for us to understand as well, and again, the care committee helped me understand this, was that a great many of those stories that we're hearing from gay white men are universally understood by folks. They aren't necessarily culturally specific. They are things that we were all dealing with. And so, it's a thank you for that, for getting us back into that, because it's something I've been really wrestling with a lot in the last few weeks.
Your point about how statistics are generated is really important. So,
yeah.
I had a question, I think, or comment.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, actually, again, similar to Kagan, about the statistics, about how it's come back around to our conversation about invisibility. I also just wanted to thank you for, I can tell that you're working through some really big questions and how to, you positioned like art as survival and how to get these stories out, and like with you as the playwright, but then, you know, being conscious of all of these outside factors. And so I really appreciate you like working through that like here with us and sharing a bit of that journey. I did have a question, or maybe yeah, maybe I'm hoping you could speak to it. I think I asked this to a lot of people because it's something I'm interested in as well, but I noticed that you are funny. You're a funny person. The way you're dealing with very serious things, but there have been jokes in your talk today. There's been moments where I noticed like the bar of faces, the squares are all laughing. So I just wondered if you could speak about the use of humor or the use of comedy maybe within your practice.
Yeah, I don't know that I've been able to translate my humor very well into my writing. Unfortunately, I try. I read something on the page and I think, oh, that's hilarious, and it doesn't always work out that way on stage. I do think that humor has played a really important role in how I, cope with the loss. I think we all do that. Certainly in those years where I was, here's more humor, where I was embedded in the gay community, what I learned from that community was that there was a permission to play, or permission to cope through humor, and to soften, I guess. I don't know, to soften, to understand, to make sense of things. And I know it's super important to me. I wish I was more successful in getting it into scripts, but maybe this next one, because there's been some really hilarious, I mean, the beauty of a verbatim project is that you don't actually write it. Other people do, and I just arrange it. I think about flower arranging when I think about verbatim theater. And there's some extraordinarily hilarious recollections that I'm hopeful will live on the stage. I'm actually sure they will, because I'm not writing them.
Thank you. Oh, I really appreciate your response. Yeah, humor, a sense of humor as a way to soften, understand, and make sense.
I should also one of the recollections from that's in the script is a friend of mine, Jackie, who was integral through those years in Vancouver. She was visiting a friend of hers in the hospital for the last time. He was going to die very soon, and she was going to be speaking at his funeral. And the last thing he said to her on the way out, and it isn't particularly funny, but I think it speaks to the importance that humor played in that community, and probably in most of our lives, is the last thing he said to her on the way out of the room was, "Jackie, tell them I was funny." Which is an extraordinary last thing, last wish. He was.
Thank you.
Maybe you can find a way to do a hilarious theatrical performance of like a government statistical report.
Yeah. Oh, well, I did think about, so we've been talking a lot about how do we address this imbalance in the script. And one of my approaches, which has been universally denounced, but I'll share it with you, was that when people do research, I'm not really involved in the world of research, but they at the beginning or end of their research, they talk about the what do they call them? They tell you all the things that are missing from the research. disclaimers, I guess you'd say. I thought it would be fun to start the show with sort of a musical rendition of these disclaimers. We didn't speak to X, we didn't speak to Y, but it's been made clear to me by the care committee that when you call those things into the room, that's what people are going to be noticing. And so that probably won't exist, but it was a funny image for me. Carol Burnett also makes an appearance in the play. I don't know that it will make it, but it brings me great delight. There was this thing. Okay, I got to share with this. I didn't know this was happening at the time, but in the 80s and 90s in Vancouver, there was a jack-off club operating where men would gather in a room at the play. It was a theater actually called Studio, wait for it, Studio J, where men would gather and jack off. And there was the one rule was no lips below the hips. And so this would happen. And then the fellow who shares this story talks a lot about the difficulty finding the very dedicated volunteers who would be there to clean up afterwards. And so I thought at that point in the script it'd be hilarious, and it probably wouldn't work unless you're of a certain age, but Carol Burnett used to have this hilarious thing at the beginning of her show where she'd come out with a mop and just sort of do this sort of physical comedy thing with a mop. So I don't know if that'll make it, but Studio J is a fascinating, lesser known time in the AIDS pandemic.
You never hear about women doing this kind of stuff.
Yeah, no.
What is it with you guys?
Yeah, what is it? Yeah.
Well, maybe you can call it the penile monologues or something.
Yeah, there you go.
Have it in your title. The disclaimer can be in your title.
Yeah.
I don't have a question, Rick, but I just wanted to say your production of Secrete was a spectacular show, and I went into it really not knowing much. I knew you through friends, and the show blew my mind. And then to learn that it was your stories brought together too was so interesting. And I think it made it was a great learning experience, but it made it even more important to know that it was connected to you and came from your heart and your experiences as well. And I remember having a discussion with you after the show, and I was asking, I think, about how the audiences were reacting, and you were saying, oh, I have all these funny parts, but no one laughs. I don't know why. It's so funny. And I remember thinking like, oh, I silently laughed. I wasn't sure if it was okay to laugh out loud. And so I love that you bring your humor into it, because you do have such great humor, and how to get that across to the audience that it's okay to laugh. And this is part of going through these processes and enjoying the art form as well, and the message, and you can have all emotions.
I think it's a fair thing to notice that when you have written a show about the criminalization of HIV and disclosure and non-disclosure, that maybe people aren't necessarily going to be quick to laugh at what things that I think are hilarious. I've started this next play with a scene between Bonnie Henry and my sort of narrator character around glory holes. So I'm hoping that might be a way to, start the show that will create some permissions.
That's what I was thinking. Like, you need to find like a way to go hard at the beginning so that people already break that.
We are going hard in the beginning.
I look forward to it. Thank you for sharing today, Rick.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really just grateful that you invited me and giving me an opportunity to dust off my not very often used anymore talking skills, public talking, so thanks so much.
We really appreciate it, Rick. And this is now 6 months that we've been doing this Creative Mornings project, Leah and I, through the Victoria Arts Council, and not always laughs, but some laughs, with every presentation. So it's good. It's a jovial community for sure, and it's growing. And so we really appreciate you being one among our first invitations and presentations. So.
Thank you. And it's great to, despite the virtual nature, it's great to, I'm relatively new to Victoria. It's great to begin to connect dots with folks and meet people just like this.
Yeah, great. Well, we'll encourage everyone to log on to our Creative Mornings page if you're interested. Leah will probably have this recording uploaded before the weekend or by the end of today. Usually she's very quick. So if you want to revisit anything that we've talked about today, or pass along the link, we'd always appreciate that as well. And that's how we grow our community here too. And it is a monthly lecture series with a rotating theme and rotating guests. So please be sure to sign up. And I think that's all I have for today, but happy holidays, everyone.
Thank you very much.
I can just quickly say a few words about our next talk. So that's going to be January 28th, and it's going to be Chris Muncia, who is an artist and the winner of the Salt Spring National Art Prize. So he's going to be joining us from, I think he's going to be overseas actually, but he's going to Zoom in. He has a really interesting photography practice centering Black bodies and gorgeous work. So we're excited for that. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you so much, Rick.
Thanks, Rick.
Thank you. See you in the world.
One day.
Happy holidays.
Bye.